I raised almost $2.5 million for my startup with a pitch deck that had less than 100 words. It wasn't because I had a rich dad. It wasn't because I went to Stanford. It came down to one simple thing: a good story. Now let me show you why it works so well, so you can avoid having another boring pitch deck that every investor forgets. Now, I'm no genius, but I have dedicated my entire life to startups and have a bunch of relevant fundraising experience. I worked at a startup accelerator and venture capital firm. I've actually raised millions of dollars myself and pitched top VC firms like A16Z, Union Square Ventures, Lightspeed, and many others. And I've helped other startup founders raise tens of millions of dollars and continue to coach founders to this day. Okay, with that said, let's get into it. In July of 2020, I decided to quit my job at a startup accelerator to work on a company that used small group video calls to host virtual events for brands and influencers. It was the height of COVID, so companies couldn't engage customers through in-person stores and experiences. So our startup would find a cookware company or a beauty brand and host cooking or beauty classes over video calls. Surprisingly, this worked kind of well. So we built a pitch deck and got ready to raise millions of dollars so we could be the next billion-dollar tech founders. But we quickly encountered a problem. Our first pitch deck kind of sucked and no one wanted to give us money. It wasn't really worse than most startup pitch decks. In fact, it had all the typical slides you would see. It was just really fucking boring and left investors more confused than when they started. This is when we realized something. Fundraising for startups is a game of information arbitrage. You as a founder are trying to give away as little information as possible to get money, while investors are trying to get as much information as possible from you founders so they can say yes or no to investing in your company faster. On top of that, investors spend no more than 2 to 3 minutes reading pitch decks, and that's if they're interested in your company. So we thought to ourselves, how can we write a pitch deck that did a couple things? First, how do we write a pitch deck that gets investors excited but doesn't give away that much information so they have to meet with us if they're intrigued? Second, how do we write a pitch deck that takes an investor 1 minute to read start to finish? And lastly, how do we write a pitch deck that's memorable? This is what we ultimately came up with. We realized we were really bad at design, so we went as minimalist as possible. Big bold text on white slides. This, combined with no more than one clear point being made per slide, made the deck really easy to read. Our startup's biggest customer was a large beauty brand, so we decided to throw a pair of sexy red lips right on the title slide so it would lure folks in and get them to wonder what the fuck these three dudes were building. Our tagline, Modern Tupperware Party, was something a couple investors had told us our company sounded like. For those that don't know, Tupperware became popular through a multi-level marketing scheme. Your grandma would host lunch parties for her friends, and then at the end would start putting away finger sandwiches into Tupperware. This caused all of her friends to buy the plastic containers, and many of them actually began hosting their own Tupperware parties. Billions of dollars worth of Tupperware was sold this way, and investors in 2020 really wanted to see a digital version of this scheme. So we decided to lean into that deck and use it as our tagline. Next, we have our team slide. I'm a big fan of putting your team slide first. That way, as the investor reads the rest of your deck, they already know who is building this company. And if you frame your team's backgrounds in the right way, you can make it seem like your team is the best possible team to be working on this problem. In our case, our CEO was the sales guy, I was the startup guy, and our CTO was the crackshot Google engineer. Next, we establish context and begin telling our story. We tell investors that we built Huddle for consumers, and in the next slide, we tell them brands ended up begging for it. These opening slides accomplish two things. First, they establish a common pattern investors see in successful startups. Most successful companies like Facebook, Airbnb, and Slack start as one idea and end up finding success elsewhere. Slack built a video game, and then they became where corporate slaves go to die, aka an instant messaging platform for work. This is a pattern that investors love. And so we open our deck matching this common pattern, and immediately they're hooked. Second, it tells them who our company is selling to, which is other companies, aka brands. This is important because our video app is actually used by consumers and brands, but we don't want investors to be confused by this fact, which is a common problem a lot of startups run into. Slide 5 is our market sizing slide, but delivered in story format. We make it seem like we once again stumbled into a massive opportunity, but in fact, experiences sell more than $500 billion of products every year. So we're actually underselling the market, which investors will probably know. We bet this would make them excited. In the next slide, we tell investors that we ran an experiment. Once again, this is our attempt to match patterns of other successful companies. Inexperienced startup founders build products without testing first. Experienced founders run experiments and get traction without building a product first. We use this slide to signal to investors that we know how to run an experiment, and we set up the next slide, which will tell them the outcome of the experiment. We then state that the outcome of our experiment led to $1,400 worth of sales from one huddle. This implies to investors that our business is running these so-called huddles. You'll notice that nowhere in the deck do we say what a huddle actually is. It could be a website, it could be a video call, it could be an advertisement. We wanted investors to be 100% clear about what we did and not be confused about how we did it. Startup founders are often get so hung up in explaining the how around their business that investors read a pitch deck and misunderstand what they do. Explaining both what and how in a deck is really hard. So we avoided it completely and just focused on the fact that we sold products from huddles. We saved the nuance of how we were doing this for when we spoke with investors live. Remember, the goal of this pitch deck was just to get a first meeting. On slide 8, we follow up our $1,400 sold with the fact that a customer of ours, Baking Steel, paid us 15% of the $1,400. This is our business model slide. If investors do back of the napkin math, they'll find that from a single huddle, we made $210. If we had just stated this outright, it might seem less exciting. But by delivering these two slides in story format, it leads investors to wonder, what if these guys did 1,000 huddles a day? What if they did 10,000 huddles a day? Maybe this could be a really big business. And just like that, we made a tiny amount of traction seem like a really big deal to investors, all because we delivered the information as a story. We then say that we started building product immediately. This makes investors think, holy shit, these guys got traction without a product? Experienced and successful founders get traction without building product first. Once again, we're matching the patterns of other successful founders in this deck. Slide 10 is the beginning of the end of the deck. It frames the fact that all the other stuff we mentioned before is in the past, and now we're focused on an exciting future. Next, we have our go-to-market slide. Your go-to-market is how you get your product into the hands of a lot of people. It's your sales strategy. It's one of the most important things investors want to know, and it's often communicated poorly or left out of decks entirely. We use this slide to show investors that we understand go-to-market, and we do that by using the term beachhead. The term originates from World War II, when the US and Allied forces stormed Normandy. A beachhead in business is when you focus resources on a small area in a market, which allows you to break into the entire market after. This then leads us into our next slide, where we tell them what our beachhead is. This is our sexiest piece of traction. Smashbox is a large beauty brand owned by Estee Lauder, one of the largest companies in the world. They really were planning on using Huddle to engage their loyalty customers and had agreed on paper to pay us $3,000 a month. We saved this information for the end of the deck so that it could act as the finale to our story. Had we shared this information earlier, it wouldn't have seemed nearly as exciting to investors. Slide 13 states in plain English what we do. This is essentially just reiterating our tagline, which, if you remember, is Modern Tupperware Party. We're not reintroducing any new concepts here. We're just synthesizing everything we've alluded to in the previous 12 slides in one clear sentence. And then in slide 14, we say, remember Tupperware parties? This ties it all together. And after the narrative we just laid out for them, it makes investors think that we're going to be the next big social commerce company. On our final slide, we finish by asking investors to help us make buying anything an experience. This alludes to the fact that our company can become really fucking big, which is exactly what startup investors want to hear. They only make money from companies that can become $1 billion in size at a minimum. And unlike most decks, we don't ask for a specific amount of money here because we want investors writing any check size to be interested in talking with us. To understand why this pitch deck works so well, we got to talk about the concept of positioning. Positioning means how do you control a narrative or get people to think what you want them to think? Human beings best understand information that's relayed in stories. That's ingrained in our biology. It stems back from when we used to sit around campfires. In our case, we didn't just assume people would understand facts relayed on a pitch deck. Instead, we spun a narrative that made them think what we wanted them to think. And we didn't expect everyone to buy into that narrative, by the way. We just wanted more people to buy into that narrative than if we had just built a typical boring pitch deck. The reality with our startup Huddle and the reality of most early startups is that in the beginning, your business and traction just really isn't that exciting. In our case, Huddle had one large company that had agreed to use it, but hadn't started using it yet. And we had a couple smaller companies that had used us and were selling products, but that also wasn't that great. And if we just stated these facts on slides and built the normal deck, it really wouldn't be that interesting. So instead, we used a compelling story to make us seem like the next big thing. And that may seem misleading, but the truth is every successful startup is great at positioning. And trust me, the pitch is not the time to undersell what you're doing. If anything, it's the time to oversell what you're doing and make yourself seem like hot shit. And investors know this, by the way. They want founders who are great at positioning because great positioning will help you with sales or hiring great employees or building product. So if you're a startup founder, think about how you can position your company to be more exciting and compelling and tell a great fucking story. Thanks for watching. This is my first video, so if you found it helpful, consider liking, subscribing, or commenting below. Maybe even get in an argument with me, and then at the end we can become friends and sing Kumbaya. But more importantly, if you're a startup founder that's trying to raise money, consider reaching out. I work with founders like you every day, and I'd love to chat and see if I can be helpful. I can't believe anyone would take me seriously. Holy shit.